Right, good afternoon, year one economists. Thank you very much for this morning. I hope you found that of use. I really enjoyed that inflation lesson part one. You know, inflation is quite it's a strange thing, isn't it? Because it's, as we said with the trade cycle, if we take out external shocks and, global financial crises and if we take out coronavirus, inflation is the guider of the trade cycle. The economy booms, prices get too high, people stop spending, they start saving, the economy goes to recession, to slump, inflation comes down, then it starts to go up again during recovery. So inflation is absolutely key. And inflation can be quite a dry topic. How long can we talk about prices going up? But the CPI, the basket of goods and what goes in and out, the weightings of importance, and the Zimbabwe evidence, I think, is really interesting stuff. So hopefully you found this morning of use. And thank you for your participation. What I want to do this afternoon then is inflation number two. As this is a twilight lesson, I will do this as a pre-recorded video. And I'm just going to take you through some stuff, and then I'm setting you 3 5 markers to do, and that will be deadlined. Well, I deadline everything for 7:30 on the day, and then people seem to hand it in on the Wednesday morning. So I'll deadline it for the 7:30 tonight, and we'll see where we go. But I am keeping an eye, people. All right, now, if you think about what we said last lesson, so about 2 3 hours ago, we, in terms of the scheme of learning, have looked at how we measure inflation via the RPI and the CPI, how inflation looks, and then the limitations of the CPI. So the kind of lack of a typical family household now. What we're going to look at today, sorry, I only saw it 2 hours ago. What we're going to look at for this session then is the remainder of the scheme of learning for inflation. So it will be looking at causes of inflation, how we use diagrams, and we'll go from there. Okay, so if you are in need of knowing what you need to look at for inflation, 2 ways of doing it. Go to the video, go to the PowerPoint from inflation lesson number 1. That was from this morning. And I think the third slide actually tells you what you need to know. Or you can go on classwork, on Classroom, and go to learning checklists. You'll need to scroll down and it will be there in terms of what you need to know for inflation. Okay. So, in terms of, you can tell that I did this as a lesson last year and haven't updated the PowerPoint other than the date. If we were in class, I would ask you to write short definitions of the following terms: inflation, CPI, RPI, weighted basket of goods, deflation, disinflation, and hyperinflation. And hopefully from this morning, you've picked up what these terms mean, okay? So if you do want to do a little pause, feel free to do so and jot me down some points. If you've paused, you're now back in the room. So inflation obviously is that increase in prices on average over a sustained period of time. The CPI and the RPI are those basket of 700 goods. They're measured in exactly the same way, but the CPI excludes mortgage payments and your kind of housing related activity. The RPI includes them because we said this morning that not everybody owns a house. The weighted basket of goods is those 700 goods. The family survey, 40,000 households, 120,000 individual prices checked. Some are constant, some are removed, some are put in when there's more popularity of a good, and they're weighted based upon their importance. So as we said this morning, education, very low weight because education is free, same as healthcare, but there is some kind of weighting going on because we can go for private education and we can go for private healthcare. Deflation is when your inflation is slowing down. Remember the analogy of the kind of foot on the accelerator pedal of a car. Deflation is almost pressing. Ignore me completely. I've made the same mistake that students make. But I can't stop the recording, so I'm going to have to make you ignore the last minute I've been talking. Deflation is prices dropping below 0%. So if the inflation target is between 1 and 3%, deflation is prices literally dropping. Disinflation is when price increases are slowing down. So prices are still inflating, but they are slowing down. So it's like taking your foot off the accelerator pedal and hitting the brake. Apologies for that. I'm only human. And hyperinflation, as we said, was that Zimbabwean 79 billion% inflation or whatever the figure was this morning. Okay, so that is the recap, and apologies for my error. All right, then. Now, in terms of the main causes of inflation, there are three types, and this leads to expectations. So let me take you through this. The first type of inflation is demand pull, and this is caused by excessive aggregate demand. So, huge levels of consumption, huge levels of investment, and that will then pull up prices, like we said with the trade cycle. Because firms aren't stupid. If they know that people can afford to pay these prices, they're going to start increasing them. Okay, because they're almost testing out the public. How much can we raise our prices by before you lot say no? And we'd often say that demand pull inflation is linked to money and credit booms. So when interest rates are low, kind of at the moment at 0.1%, when the banks are lending money, when there's debt flying around, credit flying around, people are borrowing, they're going to be spending that money. That will be pushing up prices. Okay. This will also happen when the economy is close to full capacity. Think about your LRAS curve, the Keynesian LRAS curve. We're hitting the bottleneck. Firms can't get more resources in. We're running out of capacity. So simply speaking, firms will start to increase their prices. And demand pull inflation, if we link this to the output gap that we looked at when we looked at the trade cycle, aggregate demand greater than your potential GDP. So basically, people are just heating up that economy. They're spending, they're spending, they're spending. The bankers have got their champagne and cigars. People are going out to the shops. If there's any shops actually left, they're going on Amazon and they're just spending. Okay, so and when we say there's a positive output gap, that in itself is quite negative, because what we're almost saying there is that people are doing too much. There's too much economic activity. Firms are going to be taking advantage of this, and the idea of the slow and steady GDP growth goes out the window, and we've got mass booms in GDP growth, but inflation will creep in. Okay, so demand pull inflation is caused by us as consumers, firms as investors, and it's basically us spending too much cash, and prices will go up. Cost push inflation, we can say, as the second type of inflation, is when firms are being asked by their workers for increased wage rises. Okay, so no easy way to give you an example of this. What you could say is, for example, if teachers keep on going out on strike because we want a 4% pay rise, okay? And the government kind of caves in and say, all right, you can have your 4% pay rise. That means every teacher in the UK now has 4% more money in their bank account every month. And that then leads us to that kind of extra consumption, etc., and prices will inflate. But you could also say that cost push inflation is down to increasing raw materials and component costs from suppliers overseas. So if firms have got to pay more for their resources, for their plastics, for their metals, for their whatever, because of increasing prices from overseas that we import from, we always go back to this cost margins for businesses. If costs go up, if firms want to be protecting their profit margins, they will need to increase their prices. So the public pay more, the firms are paying more, but they're protecting their profit. Okay, and you could also say, if we go to a position of whoopee deck, imports become dearer, exports become cheaper. But if our firms are having to import their raw materials, their chips, their component parts for their technology, well, same as the point above, they will have to then start increasing their prices to the public. And the third type of inflation is what we call administered prices. This is a change in prices that are regulated by the government. For example, if your water bill goes up, your electricity bill goes up, etc., you could almost say the example I gave you this morning, my Virgin bill goes up. Listen, I'm not a guy that has Sky Sports. I haven't got the time. I'd love it, but I can't afford to spend £25 a month getting Sky Sports to kind of sit in on a Saturday and not do anything else. But I've got quite a basic package. I've got like the good broadband. I've got some decent channels that I may or may not watch, but they're going to increase my bill by £4 a month just because of inflation. It's an administered price. And, in the letters that they send you, they say, if you go to other companies, you may get a cheaper price, but I can't be bothered to switch to Sky and get a dish put in and get the cable in put in. It's a hassle, okay? So I'm kind of tied in then with Virgin. You could say another administered price would be a change in indirect tax. So, for example, if VAT, value added tax, goes up, then we're going to be hit by that as people. At the moment, VAT, I forget the value it is. Sorry, I'm showing a real lack of knowledge here. Say it's 17.5% or 20%, 22%. I forget. It's one of those three. If that then goes up to 25%, obviously I'm having to pay more. So we see a level of inflation. And if firms are being hit with environmental taxes, and I know with Tim, you're currently doing market failure, the government will step in and they'll tax carbon emitting firms, coal emitting firms, increasing their costs. Well, they need to make that money back somehow. So they're going to increase the price to me and you as consumers. Therefore, we see inflation. Okay, I'm really uncomfortable in my chair. So I'm going to move and I'm going to do that, but I can't see myself. So hopefully you can still see me. These types of inflation, these causes of inflation, demand pull, cost push, administered prices, then lead to something called inflation expectations. And for the 5 markers that I'm going to be setting you at the end of this video, this really links in. So listen very closely. Hang on. So once inflation becomes established into an economy, it can be very difficult to remove. You've got to think about the psychology of money. Even the super rich, even the millionaires worry about money. All right. Now, as a kind of personal story, my family, way back when, so my granddad, when he was alive, was one of seven kids. And the family went into business together back in, I think, 40s, 50s, 60s in London, doing textiles. And my grandpa dropped out of the business to do other stuff, as did his brother. But the rest of them stayed doing it. And the family, so my granddad's brothers and sisters, made a fortune. I'm talking millions. Okay, so there were millionaires in the Slotnick family, even though my granddad had chosen to leave that. And I always remember my family, you knew they were millionaires. They lived in North London, lived Barnet Way. They all drove around in nice cars, family gatherings. When they turned up, they were all in looking like Robert Mugabe in some respects with their fine suits and that. But they didn't spend a penny. They did not spend a penny. If you went out for a family meal, they would be the ones that were kind of haggling over the bill. Well, Neil's dad had this, and that's more than what we had, so Neil's dad needs to be paying more. They didn't spend a penny. Okay, they were really tight. And even the rich, even people with millions, do worry about cash. Anyway, I'll stop talking about my weird family. When inflation sets in, the second paragraph here, then most agents, so most people within the economy, so workers, businesses, banks, are going to raise their inflation expectations. They're going to realize that inflation's happening and build it into the way that they think about things. Okay. So how does this look? A rise in inflation can lead to an increase in inflation expectations. This can then feed through to higher wage claims and rising costs. So, for example, if I'm a worker, which I am, and I know that inflation is going to say 3-4%, and I know that if my salary doesn't change, I'm going to be 4% out of pocket. I will then go to my union and say, listen, inflation's up by 4%. I really need a 4% pay rise to kind of counterbalance this, okay? And if the union then tells teachers to go out on strike, etc., 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 then yeah, we see higher wage claims, okay? So inflation expectations are an interesting thing. It's almost the psychology of inflation, and people handle inflation in different ways. You could say that for some people, if they know that prices are going up and inflation is constantly moving, what they'll do is they'll think about today and they'll say, right, well, inflation's gone up by 2% in the last 6 months. It's only going to get worse. I'm going to do the renovations on my house now. I'm going to buy a new TV now and a new car now, because who knows what the prices are going to be 6 months down the line. You get another school of thought that says people kind of look on the good side, and although prices are going up now, prices may start to reduce, or we may see disinflation or deflation in the future. So what people that are in that school of thought will do is they'll postpone their purchasing decisions. They won't spend a penny. They'll be analysing the economy, waiting for prices to drop. Okay, so there's a few different interpretations there of how expectations and the psychology of money come into play. Okay, In terms of factors influencing inflationary pressure, let's take a look. We call these transmission mechanisms. When we look at government policy and interest rates, we'll do more on this transmission. But basically, by transmission, what I mean is when something happens on the left, this is how it transmits and feeds through the economy over a period of time. And this then becomes the net result, okay, on the right hand side. So if your property prices are going up on average, the wealth effect kicks in, you've got increased wealth. You then, for whatever reason, start spending more money because you think you're worth more. Don't forget, you need to be selling your house or remortgaging to get hold of that money. And because of that increased level of consumption, there is a risk of demand pull inflation, AD consumption and investment pulling up prices. If there's an increase in the world oil price for whatever reason, there's a shortage, whatever, higher costs come into play for businesses. And because of that, then we see a cost push inflation risk. Because firms' costs are rising, they use oil, they to protect their profit margins will need to increase their price to the public, and then we see inflation. If we see a whoopee deck position, a depreciating exchange rate, we have increased import prices and rising exports. We could say there's cost push and demand pull inflation simply because, let's have a quick think about this, an increased price of import, it costs our firms more to buy in resources, but the rising exports will also lead to a level of demand for our products. And if, for whatever reason, we see a rapid expansion of money and credit from the banks are lowering their rates of interest, they're offering out loans left, right, and centre, people are accepting these loans. We see rising consumer spending financed by loans, people living above their means, people getting themselves loaded up on debt, but they're still purchasing. There's demand pull inflation because firms can get loans, because consumers can get loans. They're going to go out and take these products and they're going to spend. And if we're at the boom, the peak stage of the economy, that's going to lead us into some kind of recession, isn't it? Prices will just go too high. So those we call your transmission mechanisms, just for examples. All right, so what causes inflation then? Well, from within a country, you would say the wealth effect, the large surge in property prices, people getting increased wages and they'll then go out and spend their wages, a boom in credit, so banks kicking money out freely, and a rise in business taxes. Okay, for example, value added tax, we need to pay more. Okay, so VAT goes up to 25%. As said at the start of the lesson, prices will naturally follow. External causes of inflation, things that can happen outside of the UK to cause inflation within the UK, an increase in world oil and gas prices. Our firms depend upon oil and gases to do what they do. So if that cost goes up, they'll have to increase their prices. An inflation in global commodity prices. If the cost of coffee, the cost of tobacco goes up, then we get this into the UK. We've got to pay more to do it. We turn it into the finished goods, cigarettes and processed coffee, etc. But we're going to have to increase our price. A depreciation of the exchange rate, whoopee deck, imports become dearer, linking to the first 2 points. And inflation is like coronavirus, ladies and gentlemen. When inflation sets into one country, because of factors 1, 2, and 3, it will transmit to other countries. Okay. All right, then. Now, in terms of just to think about this morning, I am going to, I will have a brief discussion of this. The government, generally speaking, doesn't choose to print out more money for the fun of it. It will do it to replace broken notes, so like rip notes, pen notes, whatever. But during the 2008 financial crisis, the government did see the fact that we needed more cash into the economy, and it increased the money supply by point one. It did not print more notes through the Bank of England. Okay, and there's the what we call the mint. The mint, the place that produces notes and coins, is in Debden. It's if you go on the M11 towards Stansted Airport from where you guys live. About half an hour down the M11, there's a place on the left. It looks like a big kind of stately home, like a mansion. That's where we actually print notes and coins. Okay, so if you fancy robbing somewhere, that's the place to go. That's not advice, by the way. Don't do that. What the government did do was they did something called quantitative easing. You may have heard of this, and this did push money into the economy. Okay, it's basically, the way that I look at it is like digital zeros. All right, so the Bank of England will lower the rates of interest. They will literally give high street banks, Barclays, Santander, Lloyds, whatever you want to say, digital zeros on their banking figures, but they give them those digital zeros to make sure that that money is lent out to the public to stimulate some level of consumption. Okay. The rest of this, people, points 3, 4, and 5, we will leave. We're going to look at this next year when we look at the financial system in more detail. But I just wanted to give you an appreciation of the fact that the government can push money into the economy, but it will do it via the banks and it will do it very carefully. And they will only push money into the economy provided it's going to have a positive multiplier effect. It will boost the economy. Okay. Anyway, that's it. Points 3, 4, 5. We'll do in more detail next year. In fact, this time next year, I'm just starting it with my year twos. All right, in terms of the diagrams, if you want to show cost push inflation on an AD diagram, let's take a look. X-axis, real GDP. Y-axis, price level or GPL, general price level. Draw your AD as normal. Draw a equilibrium point with aggregate supply 1, and we're trying to show cost push inflation. All right, so what you're going to do is you're going to shift AS1 to AS2, aggregate supply 2. You're going to shift aggregate supply inwards because cost push inflation is about the cost of production increasing, so increased wages, increased resource costs, etc. So you're going to be pushing AS inwards as you would normally do. And what that means is we're going to have less real GDP because it's more expensive for firms to operate, and they will then have to increase their prices. So generally, on aggregate, prices will increase across the economy in order to kind of, maintain their profit margins. Okay. So on the left-hand side, then cost push inflation occurs when firms respond to rising costs by increasing their prices to protect their profit due to unit labor costs, higher prices for components and raw materials, a position of whoopee-deck, meaning imports become dearer, and an increase in tax. Okay. If you want to show demand pull inflation, you're going to go the other way. Same general price level, real GDP, aggregate supply is going to be static, and you're going to go AD1 on the first equilibrium, AD2 on the second equilibrium, meaning that we've got more real national output, more real GDP because of increased levels of consumption and investment. But everything that we've said in the lesson, price level pulls up. So demand pull inflation occurs when AD grows at an unsustainable rate, leading to a positive output gap. When we've got excess aggregate demand, producers can raise their prices and achieve bigger profit margins because they know that we've got the money to pay for what they're producing. And when we've got full employment of resources, firms will just increase their prices because they're running out of resources. They need to protect themselves. All right. So, final point then, these are the 3 costs of inflation, the downsides of inflation, and I really like these. Number 1, something called a shoe leather cost, okay? This literally means wearing out your shoes, shopping around for the best price as prices are constantly changing due to inflation. It's a very historic term. If you imagine in the 60s along the average British high street along the Lea Bridge Road, there'd be a number of shops selling the same kind of stuff, okay? But because of inflation, they were constantly having to hike their prices, but they wouldn't have increased their prices by the same. Some may have raised their prices by £1 per unit. Some may have done it by £2 per unit. And what we found was people in the 60s were literally, I don't know if this is literal, people, it might just be a saying, but let's imagine it's literal, running up and down the high street, going into different shops, trying to get the best deals before inflation went up even higher. They were wearing out their shoes. I suppose shoe leather cost today could be like, I don't know, hurting your finger by clicking on a mouse, going from Amazon to eBay to Etsy to wherever, looking for the best deal, okay? So maybe I've invented a new economic theory. I don't know, what do I call it? Mouse finger syndrome. Yeah, if you hear that in 20 years, people, and I win the Nobel Prize, remember me. The second cost of inflation, the second downside of inflation are your menu costs. This generally applies to restaurants, but it can apply to any shop that produces a menu or a price list. And restaurants see their costs increase as they have to keep on changing their menus to reflect price rises. This costs money. It's literally, and I'm going to use the word literally here. If you are a kebab shop and your cost of production, so the price of meat, the price of vegetables is going up, you might need to constantly update the menus that are above where you work that the public can see. Some restaurants choose to do this in pen. Some restaurants will have a printed menu or even like laminated with lights. If they have to keep on updating this every few months because of inflation, it costs money for firms to get this new lamination in. It's going to cost them money. And the last one, the cost of inflation, psychological costs. People feel psychologically depressed when there's inflation. And at its worst, inflation is a common cause, a common catalyst for political change and revolution. Okay. And if Mugabe didn't have the troops at hand, there would have been a revolution. The fact of the matter was, because of hyperinflation, because the way that Zimbabweans were living, to keep people in their place, if you spoke out against Mugabe, you got put in your place, you got disappeared, so to speak. But there's been many kind of political changes brought about because of hyperinflation. Think back to 1924 Germany. One of the reasons that kind of, I suppose, Hitler came in, among many other things, sadly, was to kind of say to the Germans, look, I am a way out from your current economic situation. Okay? So that's pretty much it. That was quite a rambling journey around inflation, but I hope you take something from that. What I suggest you do is two things. First things first, on the PowerPoint, save this PowerPoint and then think about what inflation does to consumers, firms, and government. This can be positive or negative, okay? And you can save this document and that's yours. But pretty much this just sums up what we did within the lesson. The more important piece of work, ladies and gentlemen, is this. I'll upload it for you. It's a bit unclear, and I apologize for that, but there's a bit of data, a bit of information, and there's 3 5 markers. Now remember, for a 5 marker, one definition, please, one answer to the question, selectively using data from the evidence. Your answer gives you the analysis mark. The use of data gives you the application mark. There is no need to conclude or to evaluate. These are only 5 markers. So basically, you go on a mark a minute, 5 minutes each, okay? You've got some nice case studies there on inflation in Brazil and deflation in Spain. Question 2 looks at kind of inflation expectations, postponing spending. So if you're stuck on that, go back in this video and I'll take a look at what I've said. But ladies and gentlemen, that's pretty much it. Our deadline is for 7:30 tonight. When you choose to do it is up to you, before 7:30 tonight. It's been a good day with you lot. Hopefully you've enjoyed, and I will catch up with you next week for, I do believe, unemployment. All right, so stay safe and all that, and I'll catch up with you later. Bye-bye.